Okay, so I want to go ahead and talk about the final project a little bit. So for the final project, I want you to investigate a particular community or a particular author, or if you have a particular idea, I can always take a look at it and help you shape it. But ultimately, the goal is to investigate, how a particular community uses writing, uses language, look at some of the syntax, and try to say something about what that's doing. So just for example, just to use an easy example, say that you were looking at scientific writing, and that you were interested in maybe becoming a chemist or a physicist, or a biologist or something in the sciences. They have a very specific way of writing and using language and using syntax that creates a rhetorical effect. So let's just say that you wanted to look at, biology. You might collect some written materials from that particular community. What do biologists write? What does their scholarship look like? What does their peer review articles look like? What do their books look like? Their lab reports, memos. What essentially uh, does a biologist do when it comes to writing, and what does that writing look like? So the goal would be to find some samples of writing from that community, right? At least four different primary materials, and to take a sample of the writing in each one of those documents, and then identify the parts of speech, the syntax, the grammar, the mechanics. Ultimately, it'd be nice if you were able to put some of this information to a chart or a graph. Maybe identifying the presence of specific types of phrases, the presence and quantification of the amount of adjectives or adverbs or something that you find relevant. So the first step would be to determine what particular discipline or field you want to investigate, and then collect some materials from that field. We'll learn about how to do that. We'll talk about how to do that when we get to that section. And then explicate those materials so that you can actually have some kind of information to look at. And then at some point, say something about what you found using some of the information in the course, some of the source material in the course that you've read. What does this particular explication of syntax in this community mean? What are you learning? What did you notice? Some of you have mentioned looking at a type of writing style or a genre like comedy, or drama, or a particular type of author, like Tom Clancy or something, John Grisham, Pulp Fiction novelists like that. Maybe if you wanted to say something about like big prime writing, like New York Times bestsellers, you might look at, okay, what is the writing style of New York Times bestsellers? Maybe you could investigate, a couple texts from that list and see if you can determine what's going on and how they're using language in a specific way. But ultimately, the goal is to look at something specific, to hone in on a particular author or a genre or a community, and collect some actual samples of writing from that community, or if it's an author, a few of their books, and start to actually break apart their language use. That's why the first part of this class we spend quite a bit of time practicing identifying those parts of speech. In this particular project, that will become really important, because you can't say anything about the ways that syntax and language are being used if you can't identify any of the parts of speech And you will need to be able to identify those parts of speech relatively accurately because that will become your evidence for the arguments that you make about what you're learning in this project. So as you start to pull apart the language use, you'll start to see things and notice things, and you'll make claims about that, but you'll have to support it with your evidence. And if your evidence inaccurately identifies parts of speech, then the things that you're saying won't actually hold true. So that's why we're spending quite a bit of time in this first part of the course identifying the parts of speech. So again, this particular project is designed to get you to investigate, how an actual community or an author or a real world writing situation functions, and how language is being used, how syntax is being used rhetorically to achieve some kind of purpose, some kind of effect. So moving forward, when you're working on this project, those are the things that you want to keep in mind. You can deliver this project in a paper. You could also make a video, make some kind of digital delivery of the research. That's fine. We can talk about that when we get to that point. But ultimately, your paper should have or account for some sections like an introduction that sets up this question that you've essentially been given, a methodology section which essentially explains what you did to collect evidence. Back to the biology example, you may say, I looked up a bunch of different biology departments. I investigated some of the types of writing they did. I accessed some sample lab reports, a sample peer-reviewed journal, a sample memo that went back and forth to two different biologists, and then you broke that down. You explicated it for syntax. That's a method. That's a way that you've created data. Ultimately the goal is that you did something, and the answers that you create are original and yours because it's your actual method. And then in a results section, I want you to tell us, everything that you learned, everything that you discovered from investigating this community, from looking over its written materials. And then the results section, I want you to try to hone in on something very specific. So in the discussion section, you may note a bunch of things that you learned. In the results section, hone in on one or two very specific things that you can elaborate on. Maybe you noticed a bunch of stuff, but some of that is kind of general information. You don't need to really elaborate on it. Just telling us what you found is good enough. But there may be a few things that you can actually elaborate and expand upon, that it's actually important to expand upon. And in the results section, that's where you want to kind of do that. The results is kind of like, what's the one thing that you learned that you really, really found important and interesting, and that you want to talk about that a little bit longer. And then, of course, you're going to have a conclusion that kind of wraps things up. But ultimately, you want to account for those sections of information in your project. Again, we'll do a lot of activities that help explain this project and help teach you about the different moves that you need to make. So don't worry, you're going to have lots of opportunities to learn each part of this project and to practice it. But hopefully this gives you a little bit better understanding of what you're trying to do. This project isn't designed to be overly complicated. Again, it's just designed to get you to look at actual real-world writing and language use and think about that a little bit more critically, a little bit more rhetorically. And if you have any questions at any point about this project, please just let me know. We can set up a Zoom chat, a phone call. I can write you back email. Whatever it is, we can communicate and figure out any questions that you have. All right, have a good week, and I'll see you soon.